Hey, this is Brett. You're watching Brett and Some Books. Just had a big gulp of water. We are reading the Bosnia list by Keenan Trevenchevich and Susan Shapiro. We're on chapter 11, My Father's Loss, Norwood, Connecticut, January 2001. Ready to get destroyed, Ken Dog? Asked my best friend Eugene, a Jewish genius with a light Slavic accent. Yeah, it's Thirsty Thursday. Well, time to get drizzed, you malakas, the other's roommate Kostas said, calling us jerk-offs in Greek, looking goofy in his Hooters t-shirt and recently dyed black hair, or blonde hair. He got a limp biscuit on the stereo. Say goodbye to Bugs, he told Danny, a skinny Portuguese Catholic geek who was getting stoned at Costa's, as Costas turned Bugs Bunny off our big TV screen. Eugene handed out Milwaukee's best for our toast. I turned on the black light above the television. Its fluorescent bulb glowed purple, highlighting 20 Maxine bikini covers lining the wall, and my poster of a scantily clad Anna Kournikova taped to the ceiling. Man, I loved college, especially living here with my loyal buddies. Except for the piles of laundry the slobs left on the floor. I was the neatest. The other guys' moms bought food when they visited. Mine came with cleaning supplies and started scrubbing, unless she was feeling too sick. But I refused to think that my mother's illness or our money problems right now. I had no Friday classes. This weekend, I just wanted to be a normal 20-year-old junior with a cool girlfriend and great buddies to drink endless beers with. Of the 4 University of Hartford suite mates I'd chosen, it was no coincidence that 3 were foreign-born. My international posse, I was the Bosnian Muslim athlete at 6 feet and 165 pounds, in my best shape ever. I played soccer weekly with Eugene, a bespectacled, brown-haired Brano, whose dad had been an engineer in Belarus. His family had been thrown out of Russia in 1990 and exiled to a roach-infested shithole in Brooklyn. It took a long decade for them to get reestablished here. When he invited me to his new home for Rosh Hashanah, Hanukkah, and Passover, I saw his mother was just like mine, a spotless homemaker and serious cook who fed me larkas with applesauce and matzo ball soup and kreplach that tasted like my mom's shavapi. Of the 55 students in our 6-year physical therapy program, Eugene and I were the only ones learning science in a second language. The most gregarious of our bunch was Kostas, the charming Orthodox Christian ladies' man who'd studied business. We'd named him Socrates because he liked to spout his sometimes nutty philosophies on everything. When we first discussed how the Greeks and Serbs shared a religion, he said, "I hate your Serb fuckers. We're not the same." And then he asked what I'd seen in the war. Dodging gunfire at 12, a bullet nicked my forehead, I coughed up. A Chetnik guerrilla pointed his rifle in my face. I saw dead, mangled bodies driven by on meat trucks. "Mad props for what you survived, man. You're my hero," he said. "You know what they did to you, the Turks did to us." Costa's mom had a brain tumor. Though he rarely talked about her, he always asked how my mother was doing. I'd tell him when she finished a round of chemotherapy or was starting a new drug treatment. We were secretly linked by the dual roles nobody else knew we were juggling. Jovial American students by day, nervous immigrant sons worried sick over their ill mothers by night. I decided we had the kind of covalent bond I was studying in chemistry class, held together with shared electrons, hard to break. Danny, our shyest suite mate, was a 6-foot-tall computer major with an olive complexion and black hair. His conservative Catholic mom freaked out when she saw our half-naked posters and his ripped jeans. "Why do you wear clothes with holes in them?" she'd yelled. We can afford new. Mom, they came like this. We're not in a village in Portugal anymore. You spend money for torn pants. That is what I teach you? She started crying. I'd come out of the shower to catch their fight. I went back and showered again. I felt comfortable and protected in this melting pot in the middle of Connecticut. Though I could afford the tuition only with financial aid, student loans, and a merit grant that meant I had to keep up my grade point average to at least 3.91. Unlike the rich frat boys slated to join their daddy's hedge funds after graduation, my suite mates and I were acutely aware of the sacrifices our family made to get us to this country. Each night we called home. Costas spoke Greek on the phone to his metera. Danny shared Portuguese with his me. Eugene talked in Russian with his mama. I'd catched up with my Mari in Bosnian. When I couldn't handle hearing how rough her chemo was, I tried to get her to feel more upbeat, asking her about Shadow, our feisty little orange-haired adopted Pomeranian, who she'd take on long walks on the beach to chase seagulls. Don't tell me you're calling your mommy again, a New York-bred neighbor across the hall ribbed me. The whole point of going away to college is to escape your family. He had no idea the real enemies I'd escaped from, or how much I worried about my mother would die at 47 and I'd never get to talk to her again. I thanked God every day my parents hadn't been murdered in Bosnia. I could have been stuck in a Balkan orphanage, growing up with Muslim kids who had no living relatives left, and Serb soldiers raped babies who'd been abandoned in shame. I couldn't relate to the superficial rebellions of some of my classmates. Another international crisis? Asked Matt, our token native-born American. When he'd heard us all on the phone, he'd always assumed we were fighting since our original tongues sounded brusque and combative to his ear. He was a chubby, witty Jewish business student with a buzz cut who, I noted, had called his folks in Pennsylvania only once a week. Matt would tease me and say, "Hey man, can you please speak English? You need to assimilate already." Since I didn't have a car, he drove me to get groceries, haircuts, dental surgery, and home for the holidays. When I stupidly broke my wrist playing beer pong, he was the one who'd waited with me for 4 hours in the emergency room. These guys had my back. "Hey, Ken Dog, Molly and Rachel want to see us at our frat house later," Eugene suggested. "You up for it?" I nodded. Eugene and I liked to double date since Rachel and Molly were both in our program. I said sure, though I wasn't an official fraternity member like most of the 5,000 students on campus. The richest frat was filled with Jewish and Catholic suburban kids. Another was upper middle class New England natives. A third house seemed a poorer and scrappier mix of Irish guys and Jews, with a few blacks thrown in. The divisions reminded me of Yugoslavia. While the Balkans split along lines of religion and ethnicity, here in the fraternities it seemed to be divided by money and class. Instead of crosses, mezuzahs, or the Islamic symbol of a star and crescent moon, as I sometimes wore around my neck, your car showed your identity. They used Navy Volvo I'd left in my parents' driveway wouldn't have fit with all the Mercedes and BMWs in the school's parking lot. I longed for nice wheels too, vowing to buy myself a good car someday. As the guys drank and played video games, I emailed Rachel, "Up for a party later?" adding, "Stay at your place tonight?" In high school, I'd wound up in bed with a cute cheerleader a few times, but Rachel was my first real girlfriend. She was a brainy New Jersey brunette who wore pink lip gloss and lilac nail polish. Her mom was a Polish Jew whose relatives survived the Holocaust. People banished from their countries intrigued me. Our shared histories made me feel less alone. Rachel always brought me Gatorade punch on the football field. That was how I knew she was into me. After I got my U.S. citizenship in 2001, she and the guys threw me a red, white, and blue party with balloons, flags, and a Welcome to the American Dream poster. Before I changed clothes to meet up with Rachel, I planned to call my parents, but at 9:30, my landline rang. It was my father's factory boss. Something was wrong. Had Mom been rushed to the emergency room again? Keenan, Dad's boss said in a solemn tone, your father had a stroke. You need to get to the hospital now. I squeezed the receiver in shock. I'd expected another setback in my mother's battle with cancer, but my 62-year-old dad, who'd never even got colds, was strong as a bull. My face must have gone pale because my roommates were all staring at me. Yo, what's up? Danny said, paused his video game. Kostas turned his music off. I need a favor, I told Matt, my voice cracking. I have to get to Norwalk Hospital. I left Rachel a message. Have to cancel, my dad's sick, going home, sorry. Matt grabbed his keys and led me to the parking lot without a word. On the 2-hour drive through the darkness, I felt torn, not wanting to leave the dumb bliss of a perfect college weekend to deal with another family catastrophe. Then I hated myself for not feeling compassion for my father. He dodged armed enemies and betrayers to get us out of Bosnia safe, without ever picking up a gun. For the last 8 years, he'd humbled himself every day to pay for our food and shelter in a new country. Why couldn't I focus on that? Because I was sick of being mature and fed up with all the bad news. A year before, Mom had been rushed to this same ER with abdominal pain. She'd recovered from breast cancer, but a CAT scan found a tumor on her ovary. After a hysterectomy, she needed a brutal course of chemo, so she had to drive herself to and from the treatments since no one else was available. My parents insisted that my brother and I stay at school and not move back home. Eldon was still living on Long Island campus of Stony Brook, finishing his graduate studies. Dad only made $25,000 at the fruit cup company, but he had insurance. On early mornings and weekends, he repainted houses for a few $100 a pop. Now, on the way to the hospital where Mom was getting her weekly chemo, I felt guilty and helpless. Working so many hours at a menial labor job was killing both of my parents, grinding them down in a series of rotating medical disasters I couldn't save them from. You okay, Ken Dog? Matt said as he parked in the hospital lot. Not really. I ran to the intensive care unit, irrationally rushing to speak with my father. I found him lying in a coma with tubes stuck in his mouth and flabby arms. He was so pale and skinny, he looked already dead. I joined Eldon, Mom, and the doctor in the hallway. Matt leaned against the wall in the corner, not wanting to intrude. I waved him over. After all, my college buddies were my family too. I had no one else in this country. If I were you, I'd pull the plug, a neurosurgeon said. His advice stunned me. I thought America was supposed to have great health care and not let people die. Even in emergency room care, here was 1,000,000 times better than Bosnia during and after the war. Mom looked over at Dr. Williams's shoulder toward the ICU, as if she didn't trust the doctor and needed Dad's advice on what to do. He's breathing on his own, the doctor told me. Surgery could drain the intracranial pressure, but it's too risky. He probably wouldn't make it. Even if he survived, the right side of his body would be paralyzed. I refused to listen. The fact that Dad could breathe with no tube gave me hope. If he wasn't brain dead, he could wake up. Eldon tried to console my mother in Bosnian, but his eyes were clouded in despair, probably thinking what I was. How many disasters can we take? I leaned on the counter at the nurse's station and closed my eyes. My mom asked for water. Her treatments often made her nauseous. How old and tired she looked, her face bloated from steroids. The chemo had stripped away her long blonde hair. Short strands had grown back in a dry reddish brown. She'd aged decades in the 8 years since we'd left Bosnia. Who would take care of her now that Dad was too sick? I was afraid that I would have to leave school, and that seeing my father this sick would drain my mother of the little strength she had left. But she turned to the doctor and said in perfect English, "Don't be ridiculous. We will never pull the plug on Keka." The doctor rolled his eyes, as if, I thought, to say, "You're only an ignorant foreigner, but you're out of your mind." I thought of the other people here who'd underestimated us. The Connecticut church lady who asked my mom if she knew what a washing machine was. The high school guidance counselor who advised me to be a mechanic because science would be too hard for me to learn in a new language. "Remind your mother how long he passed out before she found him," Dr. Williams told me. 6 hours. The longer someone's untreated, the more irreparable the damage. The doctor crossed his arms, seriously annoyed that we weren't heeding his warning. If Dad came out of his coma, he'd be a vegetable forever. "We will be fine," Mom insisted, crossing her arms. "Keka is a very strong man." She later told us in Bosnian how Dad had returned home from his house painting job at 11 in the morning, had his lunch, and then, all right, Nadia, I'll get you in the frame. I know, that wasn't very graceful, was it? Our apologies. He'd left for lunch, then changed for the factory. She'd left for her doctor's appointment. When she got home at 5:30, she was confused to see his car still in the driveway. Upstairs in the bedroom, I'm not sure if it's still recording yet or not. I think so. Oh, yeah, it is. Upstairs in the bedroom, she found him in the bed, face up, with his feet resting on the floor. His arms were spread out, his eyes rolled back into his head, his mouth open, vomit everywhere. She couldn't wake him. She followed Dad's ambulance in her red Dodge. "But Dad never had high blood pressure," I told the doctor in the hall. "He wasn't a smoker or a drinker. He was in good shape, aside from falling asleep between his 2 jobs. He'd come home, exhausted, worried about finances. Do you think stress caused this?" As if logic could fix his brain damage. "He had a weak artery in the brain that burst," Dr. Williams said. "His mother had a stroke," I recalled. "Who knows? It could be genetic. These things happen." I was reluctant to accept the doctor's assessment until Eldon sneaked a look at Dad's chart on the counter of the nurse's station and read it to me. "Middle cerebral artery, cerebral edema, intracranial pressure, hemiparesis, hemiplegia, facial droop, Broca's, and Wernicke's aphasia." Shit. From my class on neurological pathologies, I knew how dire it was. He'd never come out of this himself. Nobody could. "What, are you guys doctors?" the neurosurgeon asked in a condescending tone. "We're both in school for physical therapy. I just came from a neuroscience exam." I read my father's thick chart, filled with test results from his CT scan, PET scan, EKG. When other doctors confirmed Dr. Williams' pessimistic prediction, it hit me that we might be losing my dad. I felt winded and I had to sit down. "Will you break the news to Mom?" I asked Eldon. "That his brain is fried and won't ever get unfried?" His voice was bitter. His right side could be paralyzed," he told Mom in Bosnian. as she joined us outside Dad's room. "Even if he comes out of the coma, he won't be able to chew food or speak normally. His language is damaged." "So he won't read or understand or talk well?" she asked. I nodded. She bawled and then wiped her eyes with Kleenex and said, "I don't care. I'll take care of him. Nobody pulls any plug on Keka." A month later, he woke up. He did not recognize anyone or know where he was. He was thrashing around. Mom phoned me at school, hysterical. The nurses had tied him down. "It's for his own good, so he doesn't fall on his face." "He's no prisoner," she insisted. Since she was on medical leave from work, she came to the hospital every day at 7 a.m. He was moved from the ICU to the rehab wing, where she'd clean him up, shave and bathe him with moist pads. When he'd speak gibberish, she'd answer as if they were having a nice talk. She taped pictures of us around his room so he'd remember us. He learned to recognize her, but couldn't say her name. The first few times I visited, he didn't know who I was. He looked at me like I was a hospital employee. It shattered my heart that Dad didn't remember me anymore, that we'd never again have a conversation. We hadn't talked in 2 months, the longest we'd ever not spoken. I couldn't call him from school. He didn't even know what a phone was. "Patients neglect their weaker side," I told Mom as she fed him, sharing what I'd learned in class, "so force him to pick up things with his other hand." She put a spoon between his right fingers. He tried but spilled his applesauce on his blue hospital gown. He burst out crying and then hit himself on the forehead from frustration. I'd never seen my father cry before, and I hated it. I sensed he understood what was happening to him and was embarrassed. Of all we'd survived, I figured this would be the blow we couldn't recover from. Mom told him to slow down. "Keka, Polako." She rubbed his hair to calm him. He tried again, holding his utensil steady for a little longer. 6 weeks later, when I was on spring break in March, Dad seemed to be improving. He still didn't know who I was, yet he stared at me intently as if he recognized me but wasn't yet sure from where. He'd started working out, but he hadn't been able to take his time to exercise since we left Bosnia. Now, Mom told me, he'd sit on the edge of his bed and pump his arms. Still weak, he'd walk up and down the hallway, smiling and greeting the nurses in a made-up language of garbled Bosnian, along with a friendly "Hi" in English. In the rehab room, I watched him spinning an arm machine. He couldn't raise his right arm or leg. He had a facial droop, and his motions were uncoordinated. Yet he was so focused, you'd think he was competing in an Olympic race. He counted in Bosnian out of order. "Jeden, dva, tri, četir, pet, dva, osam, jeden." He winced. He seemed like a disabled child. As he spun on his arm bike, Dad glanced up and saw me. I waved, bracing myself for him not to know me again. But he stood up abruptly, with a surprised and thrilled expression on his face, as if he were being reunited with someone important to him, that he hadn't seen in ages. His eyes widened, his mouth opened. "Sin!" He yelled the word for son in Bosnian. "Yes, it's me, your son." I pointed to my chest. "I'm here, Dad. It's Keenan." "Ki," he tried. We clapped our palms together like we'd just won a big sports championship. Then we hit each other on the shoulder and hugged. I held on longer than usual, overcome with joy that I had my dad back. He broke away and pointed to his temple, gesturing with a clenched fist, squeezing his palms open and shut, muttering incoherent sound, making a boom noise by clapping his hands. He was trying to tell me that his head had exploded, sharing the story in his new made-up tongue. It was a rough spring break. When I returned to school, I got hit by a second blow. Rachel came to my dorm room, but didn't kiss me hello. She sat on the couch across from me. My mom doesn't want me to date a Muslim guy, she said with no preface. Why? I felt my stomach tighten. I'd been kicked out of the Balkans because of my religion. Now I was being thrown out of Rachel's bed for the same reason. She doesn't want me with a non-Jew. She was crying about it. Rachel and I had been good friends for a year before we went out. I'd met her Polish mother and thought we'd bonded over our Eastern European backgrounds. But I was only good enough to be Rachel's friend, not her lover, even though I was a gentleman who held doors and treated on dates like Dad taught me. When Rachel was sick, I'd instant message to see if she needed medicine. The thought that her mother cried because we were dating made me wish we'd never met. After all this time, I couldn't believe she didn't see why I'd find her words devastating. Did you tell me that's unfair? Did you tell her that's unfair? I yelled. Did you defend me? She didn't answer. All of a sudden, I was far away from Rachel. In my Connecticut dorm in my new country, I was back in Birchkow with Igor Velibor and Dalibor. I was adding her to the list of betrayers who'd rejected me as a kid. You should go. I couldn't look her in the eyes. After she left, I went to Eugene's room. Since I'm not a Jew, I'm not good enough for Rachel. It's not you, man. He looked up from his computer and took his glasses off. My mother hates that Molly's Catholic. She always tells me to break up with her. That's just how Jewish mothers are. They're crazy. Don't take it personally. Kostas burst in and screamed, Fuck that bitch. I never thought she was good enough for you. Danny walked in hollering, Her Polish Jewish relatives were thrown out of Europe during the Holocaust, and she shoves you aside for your religion? I knew that romantic choices had nothing to do with genocide, but I couldn't be rational. My hurt felt epic. I had close comrades from all races, religions, and ethnicities, but I hadn't kissed a Jewish girl since. Still, I had no doubt true love existed. My parents had never used sweet endearments or exchanged romantic presents. But for 6 months, we watched in awe as my mother healed my father, pouring all of her adoration and energy into getting him back to health. Then in December, right before I turned 21, we learned that her cancer had spread. Over the next 5 years, as Dad got better, relearning to talk, walk, and cook, she became weaker and weaker. She seemed to be shrinking. Just as we were getting Dad back to his old self, we were losing Mom. He seemed determined to return to strength so he could care for her now. The last picture of my entire family together was taken by Eugene at our graduation. Sitting in the outdoor auditorium, Eugene asked my father how he was doing. It was a bad day. Dad pointed to himself and said, Headache. When Eldon said, You want water? Dad answered, What's water? Mom, pale and nauseated, stood in the shade. Now that my boys have graduated, I can die in peace, she said. Stop saying that, I told her. She was proud when I landed a fantastic physical therapy job in Manhattan. I'd be working 12 to 8 p.m. with full benefits and 3 weeks of vacation. I found a small one-bedroom apartment in Queens near Eldon's, but right before I signed the lease, Mom's cancer metastasized. Her doctor prescribed Valium and a hospice. She refused, wanting to die drug-free at home. I stayed in Westport. For 6 months, I took the Metro North from Connecticut to Grand Central to work in the city. On the way back, I'd pick up food and bandages, arriving home at 10 at night to take over Mom's care from Dad. Then I'd walk Shadow, who took to grabbing the leash in his mouth whenever he saw me. Mornings it was antagonizing. It was agonizing to hear my mother moan from the burning pain caused by open wounds all over her body. What upset her most was when Shadow, her devoted companion, stopped sleeping next to her, as if he was afraid to be so close to death. In February, as my mother's breathing became more labored, a hospice nurse began staying overnight. One evening she whispered, "She'll probably fade away by morning." Dad, Eldon, and I stood by as the nurse closed Mom's eyes the last time. The funeral home people took my mother away in a black body bag. Watching her deteriorate and die, we all agreed was worse than the war. But for me, the two calamities were intertwined. Studies have shown that the leading cause of death for Bosnian women who survived the war was breast cancer, with malignancy and mortality rates as 4 times as high as their American counterparts. So I blamed the stress of the 1992 conflict for the disease that ravaged her. Was it the smoke and the poisonous chemicals used in weapons we breathed when our homeland became a battleground? Or the lack of doctors and screening available in the aftermath? Or some deadly combination of factors? Researchers haven't definitively established a correlation, but I saw it as another endless aftershock of the ugly battle in the Balkans that none of us could fully recover from or escape. At my mother's funeral, on February 6, 2007, Dad, Eldon, and I were the only 3 mourners. The closest Bosnian Muslim cemetery was hours away, so we picked a small Arab-run place nearby. The grounds were not well kept. There were none of the flowers she loved. My college buddies had wanted to come, but since Muslims bury their dead within 24 hours, and my friends were dispersed around the country, no one could make it on time. The 3 female mourners I really wanted to see were on the other side of the world. Aunt Basira, her daughter Amila, and my grandma Emina, who had been kept in the dark about her daughter's cancer all these years. My mother had decided not to tell her. How could an old Bosnian lady help her sick daughter 5,000 miles away? Mom had said in her typically self-effacing style. When I told Basira, she said, "We'll plan the service here," sobbing into the phone so hard I could barely make out her words. I was too numb to cry. It wasn't fair that my life and Eldon's had improved in this country, while my parents had deteriorated. "Don't have a big service," I warned Basira. "Grandma will be in shock. She has horrible arthritis and high blood pressure. She won't be able to handle it." When our ringing phone later showed Basira's area code in Bosnia, we learned my premonition had come true. Upon hearing that her 52-year-old youngest girl had died, Grandma Emina dropped dead of a heart attack right after the service in Birchkow. My vision became blurry, but I still couldn't weep. My college pals arrived from all directions the next day. Eugene's car had New Jersey plates. Kostas was living in Farmingham, Massachusetts. Danny had driven from Boston and Matt from Hartford. But they'd came so far just to spend a few hours cheering me up that made me feel so loved. "Yo, I got you," said Kostas, giving me a guy hug. "Anything you need, man." Danny put his arm around my shoulder. "And don't be afraid to talk about it," Matt said. "We're here for you," Eugene reassured me as they took me out for pizza. "Your mom won't let you dress like that," Kostas asked Danny, pointing to his torn jeans. Hey, remember when Danny's mom freaked out over his ripped jeans and Ken Dog ran back to take another shower to avoid her?" Eugene said. "Hey, why's everyone picking on me?" Danny wanted to know. "Because we got stoned and watched cartoons for 4 years," Kostas answered. We shared more silly memories. But real-world troubles had deepened our bond. We'd all stood together at Kostas's mom wake the year before. Hers was my first funeral. The Greek Orthodox traditional open casket spooked me. I was relieved that our Islamic service didn't display my mother's body. A week later, our little dog Shadow died. Now tears poured from my eyes, a torrent of shock and built-up grief. I flashed the Roadrunner cat. I flashed to the Roadrunner cartoons I'd liked as a kid in the Balkans, when I'd purposely rooted for the coyote. I felt like him now, the pathetic character who kept losing no matter what. He got shot, blown up, burned, squashed like a tomato by an anvil landing on his head. The hits kept coming. Yet there was also relief that Mom's 13 years of pain in Connecticut were over. She looked so sick in the headshot on her 2007 driver's license, which I still have in my wallet, next to my own. I preferred the picture of her back in our apartment in Birchcow, young and beautiful as she framed my karate diploma on the day of my big Bosnian tournament in 1991, the last time we were all happy. Amazingly, my father, the extraordinarily resilient Keka, learned to speak again in almost fluent Bosnian. With his motor and language skills miraculously improved when we moved him to Queens, where he could hang out with his old countrymen, word-wise he completely recovered, everything but his English, which vanished somewhere between his left frontal lobe and his lips. All those years of practice and usage in America just disappeared, as if his stubborn heart took control of his brain, refusing to remember we'd ever been forced to leave our homeland. And that's the end of that chapter. Very sad chapter.